There are works that do not belong to the world of the living, but to that dark territory where reason dissolves and only instinct remains. Saturn devouring his sun, painted by Francisco de Goya between the years 1819 and 1823, belongs to that realm. It is more than a painting, it is a petrified scream. Goya created it on the walls of his own house, the so-called Quinta del Sordo, without commission, without witnesses, without the desire to show it. He was already an old man, deaf and disenchanted, a witness to the collapse of Enlightenment promises, of wars, of the Inquisition, and of the return of absolutism. In that retreat, the artist transformed the walls of his home into a mirror of his nightmares. There, in the dining room where food was served, he painted the scene of the god Saturn, the Cronus of the Greeks, devouring the mutilated body of his son, as if classical mythology and personal madness had merged into a single act of despair. The myth tells that Saturn, warned by a prophecy that one of his sons would overthrow him, decided to devour each one as soon as they were born. His wife Rhea managed to save the youngest Jupiter, who eventually fulfilled the foretold destiny. This story had already been depicted in Baroque painting by Rubens, who portrayed a still majestic Saturn with a human face and solemn gesture. But Goya turned that story into a descent into animality. His Saturn has no crown or throne, he is not a god but a specter. In the darkness of an absolute background, the figure emerges naked, hunched, with bulging eyes, disheveled hair, and a mouth open in a bite that seeks not nourishment but destruction. In his hands, he holds the torn body of his son, headless, merely a pale trunk. There is no elegance, no myth, there is hunger, madness, horror. The painting was part of the 14 black paintings, that set of somber visions Goya executed directly onto the plaster walls, mixing oil and tempera. They were not conceived as public works, but as an inner dialogue. They stretched along the rooms of the Quinta del Sordo, each one showing a different aspect of fear, grotesque processions, witch sabbaths, duels, faces screaming from the shadows. Saturn devouring his son occupied one of the main walls of the dining room, as if Goya had wanted to confront the daily act of eating with its most monstrous reflection. Eating, in that space, became a terrible metaphor for the power that consumes, for time that swallows its creatures. Decades after the painter's death, the house was acquired by the French banker Émile d'Erlanger, who ordered the paintings to be removed from the walls to save them from decay. The process, carried out by restorer Salvador Martínez Cubells in 1874, consisted of separating the pictorial layers from the wall and transferring them to canvas using a risky procedure called strappo. It was an act of rescue and mutilation at once. Fragments were lost, tones altered, gaps filled in. Thanks to photographs taken by Jean Laurent before the transfer, it is known that some parts of the child's body were more visible and that the original composition was slightly different. The black paintings later traveled to the Paris Universal Exposition of 1878, where they provoked astonishment and repulsion. Today they are preserved in the Prado Museum, where one can still feel the traces of that double history, the horror Goya painted and its rescue from the ruins. The image of Saturn is not just an ancient myth, it is an allegory of time, of history, and of power. Since the 19th century, critics and philosophers have seen in it a representation of time devouring all that it has created, a metaphor for the endless cycle of destruction. But it has also been read as a political vision, a Spain that devours its own children, a society trapped in the repetition of violence, superstition, and authoritarianism. Some scholars interpret that Goya projected onto Saturn the figure of King Ferdinand VII, devouring the liberties that the war had promised. Others believe that the artist, sick and aged, portrayed himself in the figure of the mad god who cannot avoid his own self-destruction. The power of the work lies in its brutal honesty. Goya does not paint violence from a distance. He paints it from within. The light which illuminates only the monster's face and the flesh of the sun cuts through the darkness like a knife. The background is total void, without horizon or context. It is the space of the unconscious. The brushstroke is loose, almost savage, as if the artist had worked in fury. There are no decorative details, no landscape, no architecture, only the act itself of devouring. That economy of means produces an unbearable effect. There is no time for reflection, only for horror. When studying the composition in detail, one discovers small decisions that intensify the tension. Saturn does not swallow. He tears. It is not an act of consumption, but of annihilation. The hands sink fingers into the sun's back. The mouth opens wide. The eyes do not look at the body, but at the void, as if he were not even aware of what he is doing. It is the portrait of power gone blind, of fear turned instinct. Goya, with his brush, portrays the madness of a god who has lost control of his own destiny. The symbolism is multiple. On the most obvious level, Saturn represents time, which devours its creatures without mercy. On another, he represents the state or authority that destroys what it creates. But it can also be read as a reflection on fatherhood, old age, and the fear of death. Saturn is the artist who fears being forgotten, the father who fears being replaced by the son, the man who fears his own body. In that sense, the work becomes a confession. Goya does not merely paint the myth, he paints himself confronting his end. The technical restoration process has been the subject of debate. Analyses by the Prado Museum show that the pictorial layer presents cracks and overpainting, the result of the transfer. Yet they also reveal Goya's mastery in using unusual materials. He mixed earthy pigments with oil and plaster, creating a porous surface that absorbed light. The palette is minimal: blacks, ochres, reds, and a yellowish white for the flesh. That chromatic austerity heightens the sensation of perpetual night. The reds barely appear, but when they do, they are open wounds. The son's body seems made of plaster or wax, the father's of living stone. Over time, Saturn devouring his son has acquired dimensions Goya may never have imagined. Its visual power inspired expressionist and surrealist painters and filmmakers. It is impossible to look at the creatures of Francis Bacon or the darker frames of Buñuel without recognizing this Saturn's imprint. It has also been interpreted through psychology as the image of the superego punishing desire, or of the unconscious devouring reason. The philosopher Michel Foucault once described it as a vision of power devouring itself, and that reading remains relevant in the 21st century. But the painting is not just an idea, it is flesh. Whoever observes it in person feels a physical impact. Saturn's eyes seem alive. They do not look at the sun. They look at the viewer as if inviting him to be witness and accomplice. That gaze breaks the boundary between painting and reality. Goya makes horror exist not inside the frame, but in whoever contemplates it. The monster feeds on our gaze, and that explains its enduring force. It is not a myth of the past, it is a mirror of the present. The taboo the work contains does not lie only in the act of cannibalism, but in the inversion of the deepest values of Western culture. The father who should protect is the one who destroys. The god who gives life takes it away. The home where one eats becomes the scene of a crime. In the Quinta del Sordo, that painting accompanied the family table. Eating under that gaze meant facing the idea that every form of power, even love, carries within it the seed of destruction. That ambiguity is what keeps Saturn devouring his son from aging. There is always something that time forces us to sacrifice. For a long time, the public and critics did not know how to face the work. In the 19th century, it was considered an aberration, a delirium. By the late 20th century, it had become an emblem of modern art, a turning point between Enlightenment reason and contemporary expressionism. Today, it is studied not only as an artistic piece, but as a psychological, political, and philosophical document. Every restoration, every pigment analysis, every historical study reveals new shades of its complexity. In the Prado's dim light, when the visitor stands before this painting, time seems to pause. There is no distance between the ancient myth and the present. We are all children of time, and time devours us with the same ferocity with which Saturn devours his son. That is the truth Goya sought to inscribe on the wall of his house, the one that survived plaster, transfer, and centuries. The work is not merely a representation of horror, it is a warning. It speaks of what happens when power loses conscience, when fear rules, when man becomes his own enemy. Each brushstroke is testimony to a man's struggle against his time and against himself. In that desperate gesture of Saturn lies the confession of an artist who no longer believes in gods or men, but who still believes in painting as the only language capable of saying the unspeakable. That is why the figure of the god is not majestic but human, because the real monster is not in the myth, it is within us. Goya knew it, and that is why he painted in darkness, not to frighten, but to show what the century had tried to hide. That reason, without compassion, can also devour its children. Thus, Saturn devouring his son remains a tragic mirror of the human condition. Every generation looks at it and finds its own reflection. The fear of loss, the abuse of power, the madness of time. 2 centuries later, the painting still bites. And perhaps that is the true work of art, the one that never stops devouring those who behold it. The violence of Saturn devouring his son does not arise only from the subject it represents, but from the way it is painted. Goya's brushstroke seems written in rage, as if the artist wanted to rip from the wall what tormented him inside. There are no precise lines or ornamental details. Everything is stain, flesh, and shadow. Black dominates the space, and the monster's body becomes a kind of living mountain emerging from the abyss. Light strikes the pale flesh of the sun and the bulging eyes of the god, leaving the rest in total gloom. That contrast turns the scene into a nightmare suspended between the human and the infernal. Saturn's fingers sinking into his son's back seem still to tremble, and the unseen blood is felt in the tension of the gesture. It is violence without color, horror without artifice. At the time Goya painted this work, Spain was living through one of its darkest periods. The hopes of the Enlightenment had been destroyed after the Napoleonic War and the return of absolutism. Goya, once a court painter, witnessed the collapse of the ideals of freedom he once defended. His deafness, the result of an illness that left him isolated from the world, deepened his melancholy. He lived alone, aged, distrustful of everything. The black paintings were his response to silence and despair. He sought no solace in religion or politics, but in painting, which became his only way to survive spiritually. In that context, Saturn devouring his son can be understood as a metaphor of the artist himself devoured by time and history, as if by biting the flesh of his creature the god were repeating the gesture of the painter consumed by his own work. The story of the Quinta del Sordo adds layers of meaning. That house, located on the outskirts of Madrid, was so called because its previous owner was also deaf, and Goya bought it, seeking tranquility. On its walls, he painted without sketches, directly, like one writing a diary in the language of images. There were no spectators, no patrons, no academic rules. Each painting was a confession. On the ground floor, where Saturn was located, Goya lived surrounded by monstrous figures, staring at him from the walls. It is possible to imagine him dining under that scene, an old man facing his own creation, eating before the symbol of power that devours life. The fact that this painting decorated a dining room is itself a philosophical gesture, a meditation on the act of eating, on the cycle of giving and taking life. The removal of the black paintings was a crucial episode in the history of art and conservation. The process of detaching the murals from the wall, carried out in 1874, was an almost surgical operation. Gauze and adhesives were applied to peel the paint layers from the original plaster, then transferred to canvases that could be transported. In that process, sections of the original environment were lost and tones altered. Restorer Martinez Cubels did his best to preserve the essence, but inevitably had to retouch. That is why the Saturn we see today is a mixture of original and reconstruction, a survivor of both time and technique. Modern investigations by the Prado Museum have confirmed the authenticity of most pigment, though they also document unavoidable alterations caused by the transfer. The painting's reception has been a journey from incomprehension to veneration. At its first public appearance, Many critics saw it as an aberration. They could not understand how an artist of Goya's stature, known for his portraits and court scenes, could produce something so raw. Some attributed it to madness, others to delirium from illness. Yet as the 20th century advanced, criticism rediscovered Goya as a precursor of modern art. His courage in facing horror without embellishing it made him a hero to expressionists, surrealists, and existentialist thinkers. Saturn ceased to be an outburst and became a prophecy, the announcement of a century in which humanity would confront its own abyss again and again. The comparison with Rubens' Saturn is revealing. In the Flemish version, the god still retains composure, his body idealized, his gesture controlled, horror domesticated by Baroque beauty. In Goya, all that disappears. Here there is no mythology, only madness. The figure is disjointed. His eyes express not power, but despair. It is the portrait of a god who no longer knows why he devours, who acts driven by an instinct that surpasses him. This difference marks the passage from Baroque art, where violence could still be sublimated, to modern art, where horror is shown without mediation. Goya opened the door to modernity by showing that evil needs no allegory. It can be direct, corporeal, palpable. The political symbolism of the work remains debated. Some historians see in Saturn a representation of the state devouring its citizens. Others interpret it as a critique of patriarchal power, or as an allegory of the artist devoured by his own genius. What is fascinating is that all these readings coexist. The painting does not end in a single interpretation, because Goya painted with the freedom of one who owed explanations to no one. In that sense, it is modern in the fullest meaning. It seeks neither to teach nor moralize, but to reveal chaos. In 19th century Spain, that attitude was almost revolutionary. Technically, Saturn devouring his son reveals Goya's experimental talent. Unlike his youthful works, here there is no preparatory drawing or refined palette. He used thick brushes, spatulas, and perhaps his fingers to apply the paint layers. The darkest zones are worked with a mix of carbon black and iron pigments, producing an opaque, absorbing effect. The flesh tones were achieved with blends of lead white and yellow ochres, applied in quick glazes. The result is a rough, almost earthy surface that heightens the sense of brutal reality. On a philosophical level, the painting raises a question about the nature of power and time. Saturn devours his son to avoid being overthrown, but in that act, he ensures his own ruin. The same happens with time. By devouring what it produces, it approaches its own end. In that paradox lies the core of the work. Goya, old and ill, seemed to intuit that all creation carries its own destruction. The painting is therefore a meditation on mortality, the artist as father and executioner of his work, man as victim and accomplice of his destiny. Modern restorations have sought to return to the painting part of its original aspect, but have also respected its deterioration as part of its history. The cracks, the lifting paint, the irregularities of color are witnesses to the passage of time. The same time the work represents. To see the painting in person is to face not only the image of a myth, but the trace of 2 centuries of survival. That double layer, the horror depicted and the aged matter, makes Saturn devouring his son a living object, a body still transforming. There is also a deeply human psychological reading. Saturn embodies the father's fear of being replaced, the creator's anxiety before his own decline, the man's panic before death. Goya, who had seen his children die and his contemporaries destroy themselves amid wars and fanaticism, projected in this figure his most intimate terror, that of a being no longer in control of his destiny. That is why his gaze is not that of an executioner but of the condemned. The wide-open eyes seem to beg forgiveness, or perhaps understanding. There is no pleasure in his act, only horror and necessity. Contemplating this work is like looking into a moral abyss. There is no possible comfort. The viewer feels challenged, almost guilty. That is Goya's power to turn painting into a mirror. Saturn returns to us our own violence. The violence time exerts on us, the one we inflict on others. Every generation that looks at this image finds in it a different warning. In times of war, it reads as denunciation. In times of peace, as introspection. In all cases, it remains a question without answer. What are we willing to devour in order to survive? That is why, 2 centuries later, Saturn devouring his son continues to be one of the most disturbing works in the history of art. It is the testament of a man who saw too much, and who, instead of remaining silent, painted his despair on the walls of his home. It is the confession of a world repeating itself, a warning for all ages. Goya, with his brush dipped in shadow, did not wish to frighten, he wished to reveal, and what he revealed was the oldest and most current face of humanity, that of love turned into fear, creation turned into destruction, the God who, in trying to preserve his power, ends up devouring himself.